Hi to anyone who's joined us already. I'm just going to give it a minute or two before I start so people have some time to log on. So talk amongst yourselves. Right. Might be just about ready to get started. Hi everyone. If you were here last week, welcome back. If this is your first training with me, then hello, nice to meet you. I'm Kate. So I'm from Media Monks. We are working with Google on presenting these webinars on GA4 for publishers. So this is our second webinar in the series. Last week we had an overview of the platform and the fundamentals. And this week, we're going to go more into features and use cases specific to publishers. So just to give you a bit of a recap on what this program is. So the Google News Initiative is supporting this program, and Media Monks is delivering the webinars. And basically, the whole purpose of this is to try and support publishers in migrating to GA4 and into using the platform to advance your digital maturity. So at the end of the program, you can expect to have a strong understanding of how to implement GA4 as a publisher and also how to use the platform to improve your business results and to really just get the most out of it. So we will be having in a few weeks, we're starting off a series of office hours and implementation support sessions. Those are joinable by application. So just keep an eye on our website, on the Google Gather site for some more information about that program if you do want to sign up. But today we will be talking about features and use cases of GA4. This is all recorded, so if you do want to access the video later on, you'll be able to find it on YouTube on the Google News Initiative YouTube channel. So feel free to share it with anyone else that you work with or that you know that might be interested. All right. So we'll get into the content. So today we're going to start off with going through the reporting suite that's available in GA4. So you'll see that there are some differences from UA, and it's good to get your head around that nice and early. We're going to talk about events and setting up conversions within the platform. Then we're going to go into building audiences, which is something that a lot of you are probably quite interested in, a pretty fundamental part of your analytics implementation. And then we'll talk a bit about using GA4 for data analysis that's specific to publishers. So looking at things like content engagement and subscription life cycles. All right, so to start off, let's go through GA4 reports. Now, for those of you that are users of UA, the kind of now older version of Google Analytics, you'd be familiar with lots of different report sets that have lots of different individual out-of-the-box reports already. So GA4 is a bit different in how reporting is handled. It's a lot more customizable to your own business. And this means that you're not going to have kind of a lot of reports in the UI that may not be relevant to you or that you might not use. Instead, the idea is to tailor your interface and your reporting suite to kind of match exactly what you're actually going to use on a day-to-day basis, which obviously for different businesses is going to be completely different. So so the idea is that as a publisher, you're going to have a certain set of reports that make sense to you, whereas, an e-commerce site, for instance, would have a totally different set of reports. So there are three main sections of reports. The first are standard. So these are your built-in reports, right? So this is kind of the equivalent of what we know from UA. So these are the ones that are geared towards your kind of fundamental use cases. So looking at traffic, acquisition, investigating data. So looking at your events, pages, and screen views, and just general overviews of your users and activities. So they're designed to be kind of the fundamental reports that everyone would use. And so there's kind of a more limited set of them than what we saw in UA. With customization, we have a set of reports that can be customized completely. You can also customize what you're actually going to see in the menu, as I mentioned. So these are the ones where we're trying to have publishers build reports that are going to be more relevant to what they're actually looking at every day. This might be a report that you would open up every morning, depending on what your role is. So these are the ones that are going to be built specific to your business. So they're kind of designed to be more accessible and more part of your analytics UI than previous custom reports, which kind of lived in a different part of UA. And then finally, we have exploration. So these are the reports that are a bit more advanced. We can kind of utilize some advanced analysis techniques in these reports that weren't really available in standard reports or in the previous version of custom reports. So these give you the tools to analyze some much more nuanced data points about your users and to kind of get some insights that previously would have only been available through SQL analysis. All right, that's my little overview. Now we're going to go into each one in detail, and I'll show you what it looks like in the platform. So first up, your standard reports. If you've opened GA4, you've probably found this part of the UI already. So they live in the left-hand side of your screen and under the reports section. So as you can see, you've got a couple of snapshots. So you've got the snapshot at the top and then also a real-time overview as well. And then a collection of predefined reports. These will, even though they are out of the box, these will vary depending on what it is you do. So if you're, for instance, a gaming company, they would have their own set of gaming reports. Whereas as a publisher, obviously, we're going to have more of those out of the box content reports and traffic reports. So basically, as soon as your analytics property is receiving data, you will start seeing this data coming into the real-time report and then also into your other, aggregated reports that look back further. So that is your out-of-the-box section. The first report in there is the snapshot. So this is just an overview of kind of the key data points on your site. So this is something that can be customized. So you can choose what you would like to actually show up in here as your initial snapshot overview of your site. You can add comparisons. So this is similar to how we had segments in UA. Comparisons allow you to look at a subset of your data. So you can add up to 4 of those at a time on the snapshot. You can share this report as a file or a link. Maybe this is something that you customize to have the key metrics for your business and it gets shared internally every week, for instance. And you can also find insights on this section. So GA4 kind of has this inbuilt machine learning model that will look at your data and make predictions based on the past and what it thinks is going to happen in the future. And then we'll kind of highlight anomalies or things that happen that aren't quite what was expected. Okay, so this next one here is our real-time report. So those of you that were here last week would know I spoke a lot about the real-time functionality in GA4 and how it is an improvement on what we previously had in UA. So this is kind of the first overview section we have for real-time. This enables you to immediately and continuously monitor the effects that new campaigns and site changes have on your traffic. So depending on what you do, this has a lot of different uses. You might be interested in seeing, if a promotion you've been running is driving a lot of traffic. So you put the promotion up and, 10 minutes later, you want to see if it has in fact already started driving traffic to the site. You might want to look at the impacts of newsletter send-outs or social network posts and to see if there is interaction with those right in that instance. You also might want to use it for content analysis. So looking at, content performance and looking at how different articles are going at that point in time. And also you can use it for debugging. So if you've just implemented some new code on your site, you might want to check it's working in this section, right? So, for instance, if you've just implemented a new event in GTM or in Firebase, you might want to test it out and see if it's actually firing in real time to make sure you don't, go a few days and then realize that there wasn't any data being collected. So there are a lot of uses for this. This first report that kind of appears right at the top has a lot of different overviews. And you'll see that throughout GA4, RealTime is incorporated a lot more into your general overviews of different sections as well. So going into the standard reports. So as I said, this is a bit of a change from the suite of reports we had in UA. So you have two types of default reports in GA4. The first is your detail report. So these are the ones that give us detailed dashboards with a particular metric related to a certain topic. So for instance, looking at some detailed tables or timelines for, page views or screen views against content name. It's an example. The other type of default report is an overview. So rather than being a detailed breakdown, the overview is a collection of scorecards and charts that kind of summarize all of the different detail reports. So you've got your detail reports, which break down more granularly into different topics, and your overview, which shows a collection of like the top line of what's happening with all of those. So the topic itself will only have one overview section. So you can see, for instance, here in this screenshot, if we look at the first standard report section, it is acquisition. So under acquisition, we have that overview, which is, again, just the one report that will summarize everything beneath. It's designed to be a quick summary, a quick flash of what's happening on the site in that topic. And then if you want to look at more detail, you go into your user acquisition or traffic acquisition reports. So we'll get into this in a bit, but you can customize what shows up under these sections. If, for instance, you really want to look at campaign performance, you can create a custom report that will always be included in that acquisition section, for instance, that will give you a bit of extra detail. So as you can see here, we've got a few different examples of topics moving on from acquisition. We have engagement, which is really where we're looking at, it's kind of a replacement of, I guess, the behavior section in UA. So now we're looking more at engagement with pages and screens or with content. So this is where you'll see, what events are happening on the site, what conversions are happening, what pages are people looking at. So this is a really important one for publishers. We also have monetization, depending on how you set up, monetized features of your site. So maybe subscriptions. You might see, funnels in this section. This kind of, covers things from e-commerce all the way down to ads. So if you're a publisher, then and you've got your GAM integration set up, this is where you'll see reporting on the ads on your site. But yeah, it's also worth seeing if there is a way you can use an e-commerce implementation for subscriptions, because then you get these nice built-in reports on monetization for that as well. We also have retention reports. So these are also something that's great for publishers because they look at the timeline and longevity of readers. So, how frequently are people visiting and how long are they staying engaged after the first visit? How many times are they coming back? What percentage of users are coming back, for an entire month, every other day? So that's a really kind of a key new way to look at users that is available in GA4. We also have demographics, which you'd probably be familiar with from UA. So this is where we look at things like age, location, language, and gender, as well as interests. So, using Google signals and other signals from their behavior on site, what kind of topics and categories are people interested in. And then finally, we have our tech reports. So this is where you can look at the technology your readers are using. What kind of platform are they on? Web? Are they on app? What kind of browsers? And this is a good place to make sure that your site is functioning in a in an optimal way, no matter what kind of platform or browser a user is on. So that is an overview of the standard reports. I'm going to go into slightly more detail on some of those topics. So starting here with acquisition, this is where we learn about where our readers came from. Again, this was a topic we had in UA as well. So we're looking at things like acquisition source, which campaigns are they coming from, which source and medium, are they actually clicking on our search ads? Are we getting a lot of, Google Ads traffic? What channels are driving people? Is it mostly social for you? Is it mostly search ads? Is it display? This is where we find out all of that information. So you can see here that it might be kind of small on your screen depending where you're looking, but this report we're looking at here is under acquisition, and it's the out-of-the-box user report. So this will show us a breakdown of channels and sessions. We can add a secondary dimension like you could in UA if you want to break down even further into things like source and medium. So, while all of these dimensions are obviously available in other parts of the platform, for something like this, we can always add a secondary dimension if we just want to use the built-in report to go into a bit more detail on acquisition. So, yeah, just a reminder that we still have that secondary dimension functionality if you want to drill down into your reports. Next up, we have engagement reports. So this is something, as I said, is really important for publishers. We're looking here at content, conversions, and events. Something that I think is really great about GA4 is the shift towards thinking more about engagement rather than just, aggregate page views, aggregate sessions. As a publisher, especially, you want to focus on things like how often people are coming back, how much they're reading, if they are reading the entire article. So engagement is a much more, a much more relevant or useful concept for a publisher than just aggregate page views. So these reports include not only an overview of, who's coming to your site and what they're looking at, but also your events reports. So where you can see all the events that are firing and break down into them further as well to look at parameters. But also your conversion reports. So what was previously living, on its own in goals under conversions, we now consider part of engagement, right? So we can label, any event a conversion, and then that will start being reported on in detail in this engagement report section. So the events report shows you information about what people are doing on your site or your app. In terms of setting up events, it's worth considering questions like, do you need to know if users are performing a certain action? Is it of interest to you to see that people are clicking on the subscription detail button, or that they're, clicking on certain modules on your site that you're trying to test out? You might want to be having an event for every time someone clicks on the related article module or something like that. So events can be really useful for actually seeing what's happening on the site and optimizing the site for your users. You might want to see what kind of revenue is associated with an action. So with events, you can set a revenue for an event completion. So, you might have an event for subscriptions and you might attach a dollar value to that, or whatever currency it is that you use. And then you can actually kind of have that built up reporting on revenue just based on event firing, without having to do e-commerce. So if you've got just a basic subscription model, and you want to try and, keep track of the actual revenue associated with subscriptions, that's probably something worth considering. It means you don't have to do a full e-commerce suite. And also you might just want to know what the most common actions are that people are performing. So you don't necessarily need to use this just to drill down into an event. It's also good to get an overview of, okay, this is what people are doing in relation to everything else happening on the site. So, as I said, any event can be marked as a conversion in the admin section of GA4. And once it is, that's when you'll start seeing conversions reported in the conversions section, which makes sense. So this section shows you which conversion actions are the most common. So it might help you answer questions like, why aren't people completing certain conversions? Is there a drop off that's happening? Is there some kind of barrier in terms of either the UI or in terms of like usability that's causing people to not convert? How many people can perform each conversion action? So, how many people signed up for a newsletter, for instance? How much revenue is associated with each conversion action? So this is a great example with the subscriptions event we mentioned earlier. And how do I optimize my website to increase conversion? So you might want to dig down into whether load time, so page load time is affecting conversions, or whether content is affecting conversions. If there's a certain section that people are visiting before they subscribe that seems to be really driving conversions. There's lots of different questions you can answer. So it's always worth thinking about what actually matters to the business when you're setting up your events and then planning out which ones will be conversions. So moving on just to another part of the engagement report. So as I said, this is one of the more important sections for publishers. So we do go into a bit of detail on it. The other part of engagements that is kind of more familiar from UA is the pages and screens report. So now, given the consolidated model we have of page views and screen views being measured as events and unified, we look at, our all pages report is now our page and screen report. So we can look at everything at once, makes it a lot easier to get a holistic view of how content is going. So this will show you, the pages and the screens that your users are most engaging with and visiting most often. It helps you answer questions like, what pages are people spending the most time on? So, which articles are getting, the longer average page views and like a longer engagement time. Users missing certain valuable screens in my mobile app. So, do you notice that there's a really high page view per session rate for a page on web that doesn't have the same correlation on app? And maybe that's something to do with the interface on app or with how things are loading. It might help you discover a little bit of a usability issue, for instance. And just generally, this section is great for looking at which content is the most popular. So what articles are doing really well in terms of sheer aggregation, or in terms of time on page, or in terms of, engagement time as well. So the primary dimension, as you can see an example of here, doesn't necessarily have to be stuck as it is in that initial default report. You can use the drop down to change that to something else. And GA4 will give you options based on what is logical and what makes sense with this particular section. So for instance, here we can change the page path and page title dimension to something like content group. So just a reminder with that little shout out that we do still have a lot of those functionalities from UA where you can change your primary dimensions, add secondary dimensions, and really use these reports as dynamic as you would have in the old version of GA as well. All right, I think I've gone on about the engagement reports for long enough, so I'm going to move on to monetization. So this section is where we look at revenue. For a publisher, this is most likely going to be associated with paid subscriptions. So this section is designed to help you understand how users are interacting with products that you sell. So for example, if you had paid subscription plans, a range of different plans, you could use this section by implementing e-commerce tracking to track journeys from impressions to subscription. So the key thing here is that to do this, you do have to have an e-commerce implementation, a GA4 e-commerce implementation, which means that you're using the kind of out-of-the-box event naming conventions to track the whole journey of someone from initially getting an impression of a subscription offer to purchasing a subscription. So for those of you that have used this in UA, it's really similar. So I think if you've done it for UA, it's really not that difficult to make the switch to GA4. There's just a bit of tagging manipulation or data layer updates you can do, but it's really the same principle. If you've never done it before, it is really worth considering if you do have a paid subscription model and you want to have a kind of clear understanding of what's happening, in terms of people seeing the offer and then deciding if they are going to convert. So yeah, the e-commerce model is kind of like a nice intuitive funnel where you go from first having an impression of something all the way through to, adding something to the cart and then finalizing payment and converting. So these reports will provide all of that detail on monetization, on impressions, on click to buy rate, if you have used that out of the box e-commerce implementation. If not, this might not be a very relevant section for you, but yeah, definitely worth considering if you do have a subscription model, getting this funnel tracking in place. So this section, if you do have that implementation, will help you answer questions like, which products or subscription plans or services have the fewest number of views. So, which ones are really not getting a lot of either impressions or clicks, are some of them just not very appealing, or are they not, being surfaced enough for our users? And also, which products or subscription plans or services are people adding to their carts? So what are the ones that people are clicking on and considering? Is there something that might be causing them not to completely convert? So yes, a great section for subscriptions if that is something that you do as a publisher. The next report, this is our retention report. So as I mentioned earlier, this is designed to look more at how users are interacting with your site on an ongoing basis. So, how frequently they're visiting, as well as how long they're engaging. So a cohort is the terminology we're using here. And this is a group of users who have a common characteristic identified by an analytics dimension. Okay, so for instance, all the users that had the same acquisition date belong to the same cohort. So this means in this section, you might have a cohort of people who first looked at the website on the 1st of February. Okay, so that would be a cohort. The thing about grouping people into cohorts is it makes it easier to kind of analyze their journey over time to see what percentage of that cohort ended up visiting all throughout the month, what percentage only visited once, then dropped off, what percentage came here once and then looked at the site for a week and then left. So that's kind of the idea of using cohorts to group users together to simplify this otherwise pretty complex task of looking at retention and frequency of visitation over time. So it should help you have a better understanding of how your valuable users it should help you understand who your valuable users are, because you can kind of have a look at the additional revenue, generated after a first visit. Who are the users that are ongoing, frequently visiting, consistently subscribing, or signing up for newsletters and things, or the ones that are just visiting and generating a lot of page views and a lot of ad revenue for the site as well. So it's kind of it's a good way to think about your user valuation. It's kind of what we do with Google News Initiative in terms of looking at that frequency of visitation, length of, loyalty to the site, to kind of have a more nuanced idea of who is a valuable subscriber or a valuable reader. So, so the cohort section gives you a good idea of how you're going with retention without having to do much complicated analysis yourself. Next up, we have our users section. So this is where we have our demographic reports and our tech reports. So if you want to understand things about who your users are and what devices they are using, this is the section to look at. So the demographic report will tell you about where your app and website traffic originates. So, in terms of countries and things like that, or in terms of age is another section you can look at, or gender. Whereas the tech details report helps you identify the technology people use to access your website or app. So this are things like the browser, screen resolution, app version, and operating system. So this helps you answer questions like, should we improve the user experience for certain screen resolutions? Are we seeing a really low engagement rate and retention rate for a particular screen resolution or a particular browser or operating system? So if you activate Google Signals, this will give you more of a holistic view of your demographic and interest data. So what this is, you've probably seen the term around, particularly if you've done some administration config in GA4. Google Signals is data from users who are signing in to Google. So across the web, like for instance, for myself, I'm always signed into Chrome on my phone, so I'm sending Google Signals. So when this data is available for a user who's signed in and consented to send it, analytics will associate data it collects from users with the Google accounts of those who were signed in and consented to share this information. So it's saying that if I've consented to share Google Signals, then it means that GA is able to get that demographic information about me based on my Google Signals. So it's another little piece of data collection that is worth activating if you are interested in demographics and looking at those different subsets of your users based on, where they're from, what they're interested in, what they're often looking at when they're browsing the web, that kind of stuff. So that's just a little pointer if you weren't sure what Google Signals are. Okay, so that was the standard reports. Quite a few little bits to go over there. I might try and have a look at some of the questions we've gotten now. If you just give me 1 second to do a little reading. I'm going to grab a glass of water or something. Okay, so the first question we have here is about finding real-time users on pages. So, for instance, if we want to look at, real-time, I think this person's saying if we want to look at real-time, what articles are getting a lot of user views at this current moment. They're saying there's only, at the moment, you can only really see 5 pages, and it's showing a small amount of the screen. Is there a way to see the top 25 articles having the highest number of users in real time? Something similar to the real-time content insights dashboard. Yes, okay, cool. Yes, so what this person is saying, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, is that when you're in the real-time section and you're looking at article views, you're having trouble seeing a full list and you want more of an exploration into the full report of top articles. There are a few ways to go about this. I have done some work with one of our clients on GA4 with setting up like real-time reporting. So looking at the API for GA4 real-time. We use that to create Looker Studio dashboards. We use that in BigQuery as well with streaming export. So you can either do it with streaming export or with the real-time API. And that means that using that API, you can basically send your data either to Google Sheets, something I use a lot, so AppScript to access the API data, or you can do it with another platform. And then that enables you to create kind of a live table that can be connected to a dashboard so that you can see in a lot more detail what are the articles and what are the features of them. I think that's probably the way that I would do it. I might be potentially missing out on another way of doing it. Potentially in your actual engagement section, you might have a look there to see your top reports. But if you're using real time seriously and like using it quite a lot and as like a really key, a key report that you're looking at a few times a day, for instance, I would highly recommend looking at the API. It's really easy to use. It's very it's vastly improved on from the UA version. It's a lot faster. So I would recommend doing that to gather your data, connect it to a dashboard if you want, or even just connect it to a live Google Sheet. You can kind of get everything you need out of there with extra dimension breakdowns as well. Okay. User acquisition in UA, landing pages, all pages will lead you to the top 10 or 25 articles for that selected period. Secondary dimensions will give you details like referrals and medium of acquisition. However, in GA4, it appears the basic info first available is medium. Getting acquisition, article landing pages are in secondary dimensions. Yes, okay, so I think this question is saying that there's a difference here in how the report is structured by default and that you're getting a primary dimension of medium and then your article landing pages are a secondary dimension. So the best way to handle this would be to make a custom report. And this is the section we're about to go into now. I might actually just go into this section now and come back to our other questions in a second, because this is going to be directly relevant to some of the questions I can see coming in. So hopefully this will help answer what you're trying to do. So thank you for the perfect segue, whoever asked the question. Basically, with custom reports, the idea here is that this is where you would build those reports where you have a very specific idea of which dimensions you would like to have as your primary and secondary dimensions, for instance, which metrics you want to view. This is where you can change the report to show you what it is you actually want to look at. So in that situation, like this person has said, where they've said, the primary dimension that's there isn't necessarily the one I'd want to use. I'd want to use something that's like a landing page, for instance. You could, it'd be best to create a custom report or to customize an existing report to get that primary dimension by default. And now we will go into how to do it. So to do this, the first thing to shout out is that you need to have the editor role on the property. So because you are changing the actual UI of GA4, like when you make this change, it will affect your property. You need to have the editor role, so something to keep in mind. If that's not a role you don't have, you can also pass along to whoever in the organization is responsible for that. This is the report I want. Can you please add it to the UI or to the collection? So you can have a lot of custom reports. You can have up to 200. So there isn't really any issue with running out of space there. This is a really good way to build the reports that matter to you to use on an ongoing basis. So we have two ways of doing this. The first is by customizing an existing report. So for instance, like the example the person gave just before of I think they're talking about the acquisition report. One of them is you can customize an existing report that's already out of the box by making a few tweaks, or you can create a new report in the GA4 library. So if we're going with the first route, we've got customizing an existing report. To do this, it is pretty simple. You will see up the top right of your screen in GA4 that there's a little pencil. If you click on that, that will enable you to customize your report. So what we can do here is update the actual inputs that are there by default. So you might want to, change the dimension you're looking at, change the metrics, change, what kind of visualization you've got. So by default, you're often going to get a line chart, a bar chart, and a table, and you might want a different type of visualization. You can change that. And you can also play with the summary cards that are showing up as well. So the default summary is on the page. So you would click edit, update those inputs, and save the changes either as an update to your current report, which means that will change what the report looks like in the UI, or as a new report. And if you save it as a new report, it goes and lives in another section called the library. So two options. If you save it as it is, it's going to replace the current report with the new configuration. So for instance, with the example we had before, that would mean that you're updating to get a new primary dimension. That would be, the one that you're more likely to use as a business on an ongoing basis. You might say, yep, let's just update the existing one. That's going to be the primary dimension we want to use. So we'll just have that forever in place of the old version. Or you can save a new report, which can then be used in other ways, which I'll go into in a second. The other way we can customize is by creating custom reports. So as I said, in GA4, we have this section called library. This is hidden down the bottom of the screen, and it is a really, really powerful part of the UI, and I highly recommend you play around in it. This is basically where you collect your custom reports and you can tell GA4 what you want your menu and your interface to look like. Okay. So if you click on library, the little folder down the bottom left of the screen, you'll see that you've got a section where you can create reports from scratch. And you can also create collections, which I will go into in a second. So if you're looking at your report section and you want to create a new report, got a couple of options. The first is to create an overview report. So like I was saying before, those are the summaries that just have top line scorecards and charts for a whole topic. Or you can create a detailed report, which is where we have our broken down tables and our specific charts related to that report. So in the example that we were talking about earlier of changing the primary dimension of an acquisition report, this is where you would use a detailed report. So I'd go to the library, I'd say create report, detailed, and then I can either use a blank canvas or an existing template. So you might find that one of these out-of-the-box templates kind of has what you need, or you can just go from scratch. From there, you'll end up with a similar little pop-out that we saw just before in customizing an existing report. This one is where you can decide which dimensions and metrics you want to use. You can also add filters if you want to just look at a particular subset of the data, and you can decide what charts you want to see. So for the example we've been talking about, I would have a primary dimension of landing page, for instance, and then a secondary dimension of session start events, something like that. I choose my dimensions and metrics. You literally just have to pick one of each, and that's all you need as a basis, or you can add all the extra detail you need. Click save, and then you will have your custom report. So once this is created, it will live in that library section under your reports, and it's also possible to add it to a collection that you'll see in that library section as well. And this means that you can basically say, I want to have this report included in the collection on an ongoing basis, and then it will live in your UI along with all of those other acquisition reports. I think I'm going to go into more detail later on the collection side of things, but for now, this is how you make those custom reports that you want to use on an ongoing basis, that you want to have saved, or even how to customize one that's in there and have it be the default ongoing. So hopefully that helps. Next up, we're going to look at the exploration reports. This is another section that is really handy if you are, having trouble finding reports that you used to use in UA. It is a bit of a shift from UA to GA4 because a lot of the reports that were just there and created already, you won't have created automatically anymore. You've got to make them yourself. So you can either do that as custom reports or you can do them as explorations. So explorations are best to use when you're trying to do either ad hoc analysis, so a report that you're going to pull once and that's it. So like it doesn't need to be a custom report that's going to live in your UI forever, for instance. So it's good in that sense when it's an ad hoc report. It's also good if you're doing more detailed analysis that requires a bit more complicated data modeling. So in general, like the rule I would use is, if it's a report that you're going to use every single day, if it's like that landing page report that you need to use every day, I'd make that a custom report and I'd consider adding it to the actual collections that live in my UI. But if it's just a random thing where I want to look at how a certain, article is performing within different segments or something like that, then I would use explorations. So what we can do with exploration is we can quickly perform ad hoc queries. So you can really utilize the tools available with SQL just by using drag and drop of your dimensions and metrics. You can easily configure and switch between techniques, so you don't have to kind of know exactly what you're doing from the get-go. This is a good section to explore and play with your data and to figure out how everything is relating together and how it all works. You can sort, refactor, and drill down into your data. You can focus on most relevant data by using filters and segments really easily. You can share your explorations with other users of your property. So you might want to make it available to everyone in your property. And you can also export the data to other tools. So you can export the actual final CSV you end up with after you've applied your analysis. So here are our different features of the exploration reports. So first up, they live under the Explore tab on the left-hand side of the GA4 UI. So that's where this is where that will take you. They also have a number of out-of-the-box reporting types. So for instance, you've got freeform. So this is like where you're kind of playing around with your different dimensions and metrics in a table model. So that's kind of useful if you're trying to apply, different visualizations and you just want to play around with your data. Cohort exploration. So like discussed earlier, this looks at the behaviors and performances of groups of users related by common attributes. So looking at, for instance, the acquisition date and how those cohorts behave. Funnel, this is a really great one if you're looking at the different steps people take to complete tasks on your site or your app, and to see how you can optimize the experience on site and identify over and underperforming audiences. So we'll go into detail on this one in a second, but you can basically use a funnel to find a group of people who are just about to convert but don't, and then export that audience for retargeting. Segment overlap, which shows you how different segments relate to each other. So you can use this to identify new segments of users who meet certain criteria. User exploration, which is where we can kind of drill down into user activities within these segments. Path exploration, which is kind of like where we have our different possible paths all mapped out in a visual way, so you can see how people are flowing through the site. So it's like the user flow, if you ever use that report in UA. And user lifetime, which lets you explore the behavior and value over their lifetime as a customer. So looking at that full journey of a user as well. So there's a lot going on here, and it takes a while to kind of get your head around everything that's in here. But I'll give you a quick overview, and I highly recommend you go and jump into these reports and play around with them a bit, because it's kind of the best way to figure out how they work and which ones are good for what. Okay, so the way that these work in general, exploration reports, they'll all have this nice tab on the left, which is where you're doing your configuration. So you've got 3 different variables to choose from on the left. You've got segments, so your subsets of users. You can either apply one of the built-in segments or click that little plus sign to add a segment or create a new one. You've also got dimensions. We know what those are. You can click that little plus sign to import more dimensions into your kind of workspace that lives here. So just as a side note, in the exploration reports, you kind of have this like set of dimensions, metrics, and segments to play with. If you want to, get rid of some of these and then bring different ones in, do that at the start of your analysis so they're all kind of ready to be used. Just kind of makes the UI a bit less messy, and it means that you can drag and drop really easily. And yes, same for metrics, that if you want to drag in a metric, you can, and you can click that little plus sign to import more into this section you're looking at. So this is also where you can change the time frame up on the left here for your report. So keep an eye on that, because sometimes it will do unexpected things with the default time frame it gives you. So in terms of creating a report, once we've chosen our variables, you can go and pick out your visualization. So here you can see there's a number of options, like a bar chart, a pie chart, a simple data table. You can drag your variables into you can drag your segments into the segment section if you do wish to apply a segment. Don't have to. And you can apply your dimensions into your rows and also into columns if you are using like a pivot system. Your metrics go down into the values section, and then your filters are down the bottom if you want to add them as well. So if you do need to apply a filter. So here is a really basic example of an exploration report where we're looking at mobile traffic. So this is active users broken down by country. So as you can see, we've got this one little tab up the top with the default name of Freeform 1. You can add multiple different tabs to the same exploration. So, once this is saved, you can go back to it and you'll have lots of tabs that relate to the same thing, for instance. Here we've just had someone do a really simple dimension of country, a really simple metric of active users, dragged those into place, selected bar chart, and then this was created. So very simple to do. Once this is here, it's saved in your Explore section. You can share it with other users if you want. You can make it, shared within your company or your team. And you can also download these, to CSVs and things, or a PDF. Just a note that if you want to share with users, it's in read-only mode. So it's something you create, you share with them, and that's something they can look at. So that is a little bit of an overview of exploration. They are extremely handy, these reports. And as I said, there is so much to them that I really think it's best to jump in there, play around with the data and see what they do. Play around with some segments and segment overlaps because, yeah, it's really a big advancement on what was previously available with custom reports. So there's a lot to get out of them, depending on what it is that you do in your business. Okay, I'm going to take a couple more questions because we're about to move on to events and conversions. So, I keep like moving to a section and getting a very relevant question straight away, which is nice. What is not set in events and how to identify the not set so that it has a specific name? Yeah. Not set is a pain. It is the bane of my existence as well. And it often will happen based on an error in tagging implementation. So it doesn't always mean that something is wrong. Sometimes something will be not set because it doesn't make sense for there to be a value. So I just need to think of an example so this isn't too abstract for you. But okay, say for instance, if you had an event parameter for content name or article name, let's say article name, and you've got all these pages on your site that don't have articles. You've got a page that is, the home page that doesn't have one specific article name, we can assign it. You've got, a page on your subscriptions. You've got a page for contact us. You've got a page for careers. Those pages will all not have a value for article name because there is no value that makes sense for that page. So you'll see not set come up in that case when that's a parameter that's been applied to all of your page views, right? So if you say for every page view, we want to collect article name, some of them won't have one, you'll get not set. That's not a problem. It doesn't mean anything's wrong with your tracking. It just means that that parameter will not collect a value in certain cases. If it's bothering you a lot, you can always filter it out. You can create a custom report where it's automatically filtered out. If you've got that as like one of your key custom reports in the UI, I'd probably have a filter that gets rid of not set. So in that case, that's nothing to worry about. If you're seeing it as the only value for an event, or if you're seeing that it's not picking up article names where it should be, that will probably mean that there's an issue with data collection. So depending on whether it's web or app, if it's on web, you might find that the data layer isn't pushing through article name for all of the pages that you want it to. So that's something that your developers can try and rectify, fill in some gaps in tracking. Or maybe you've set up your collection tags and GTM incorrectly and it's not looking for the right variable name or something. So yeah, if it's not coming in for something and you want it to, I would definitely first look at the tracking, open the site, go to a page where you're expecting that value to populate. And if it's not, have a look at the data that's coming through and see if there's something missing or if the variable name isn't being picked up correctly by GTM or something like that. So yes, it is very annoying to get not set. It's good though when you notice it because you want to notice it early so you can rectify it and get the data collected quickly. All right, what else do we have? I'm not going to be super helpful with Search Console, unfortunately, and AdSense. So I won't answer that one because I don't think I will get it right. Apologies for that. I'm not a search ads expert myself. How can we see real-time users over the previous 24 hours like UA did? GA4 only allows the last 30 minutes. Yeah, true. Okay. So UA, yeah, from my understanding, UA did generally show the last 30 minutes, but we would show 30 minutes for active users. But regardless, if you want to look at the previous 24 hours in GA4, this is a case for the streaming export, which is an optional intraday export that you have in GA4 for BigQuery. So your standard export is just every day. So it'll just aggregate the end of a day, send it through the next day. Intraday means that it's real-time streaming of your events. So it will show you, everything that's happening in the current day. It involves a little bit more understanding of analytics and dashboard building to use it. But basically what you can do is set it up. Depending on how many events you collect, it shouldn't add too much of an extra cost to your BigQuery bill, but definitely check that. It's based on total number of events you're sending. So if you have a lot, it might be a big increase in cost. If you don't have a lot, it's probably worth doing. Anyway, that will give you an export into BigQuery that's kind of a real-time streaming table. You can then, use that in dashboarding. You can use that in a BigQuery report that you can kind of have scheduled to replace itself every few minutes. And that will allow you to see, the past 24 hours, including current time as well. So I would probably do that if it's something where you want to look at the whole day and there's specific values you want to look at. The real-time export is really advanced for GA4. So that's something I've started using. And it's definitely stronger than what we had in UA. So that's really cool. What are the differences between user acquisitions and traffic acquisitions? This is a great question. So something with GA4 is kind of moving away from focusing primarily on sessions and session acquisition to instead looking at how do we get users, and then as a subset of that, how do we get traffic as well. So you'll find that in the data model for GA4, we have the source of a user, like their first original source, which might be, they came from Facebook, they came from a newsletter. No, well, they wouldn't have come from a newsletter. They're brand new. Take that back. They came from Facebook, they came from a Google search, they clicked through from another news aggregator site, for instance. That's their first user source. So that's attached to them forever. And that's saying, this is how you get users. This is how you got all of your new users over time, right? Traffic acquisition is instead looking at session, right? So it's saying, okay, we've got this value for users and where we're getting them from. How about individual sessions? This is something you'd want to use to look at how a campaign is doing, right? How many existing users click through on our newsletter? How many existing users click through on the Facebook post, and how many new users click through on the Facebook post? So there's kind of different use cases for them. But yeah, basically like a user acquisition is looking at the original source. Traffic is more looking at session level and what's happening in the current session behavior on your site. Yeah, very good question. Okay, so another question from the person who asked our one about the landing pages, and they're saying that it's important to give emphasis to promotion activities. Is there an option to list the top 10 articles and how many came to each article through search, how many through social media, how many through paid promotion? Okay, this is actually a great case for exploration, I would say. That's probably the easiest way to visualize it. If you're wanting to look at a lot of articles and, a specific set of channels. So you could do that in a custom report, but it might be easier to do it in like a pivot table. So I would probably use something like these reports we were just discussing. Again, this is showing a really simple example here, but if you look at the actual config options, you can have your rows and your columns, you can filter, you can sort however you need to. So in this case, you could, for instance, have your rows being articles and just limit it to top 10. And then you could have, obviously, your values being page views or session starts if you're looking at landings on those article pages. So top 10 landings, and then your columns can be channels, right? Or source medium. And if you don't want to look at all of them, you can filter for specific source mediums, for instance. So that's probably something I would do there. It's, you can use that pivot model so that you can try and see both of those at once. And then again, as we've said, that's something that can be shared internally as a read-only report if it's something you want to use on an ongoing basis. So yes, that's one option. And also using Looker Studio as well is always great for something like that. Okay, unassigned in GA4. I'll have to come back to you on that one because I want to make sure I'm not thinking of something else. Site speed report in GA4. Okay, so site speed doesn't come immediately out of the box in GA4. However, there is a pretty simple implementation you can do to collect site speed data, just kind of using the JavaScript on the page. You do need to use developer support, but it's an event you can set up, a parameter you can set up that will pick up how long it took the page to load. You can put it on your config tag so that every time someone loads a page, you send the data there, and then you'll end up with a custom event that you can use, a custom parameter you can use in your reporting to look at site speed by page or overall, things like that. So yeah, it's not an automatically collected and generated report, but with some pretty simple GTM work and Firebase work, you can push it through as like a custom parameter on your page views. So have a look into that. I've set it up a fair few times now, and it's pretty simple to do. Do I recommend creating customized reports in GA4 versus Looker Studio? Yeah, this is a good question as well. I think that using, they've got different use cases. GA4 is like, I think there's more times now when I would use GA4 instead of Looker Studio, because GA4 has a lot more ability to customize the UI than Universal Analytics did. So, if someone said to me, okay, we want to have a report on, marketing for the last 7 days by this custom dimension or something like that, I would say, okay, well, if that's something you want to look at every single week, then let's make it a custom report in GA4, right? Like if it's like something that you're going to be using every other day, it's part of the business, I would say, let's add that to the UI. Dashboarding Looker Studio can also be used for that, depending on how your business works. Maybe people just prefer to do it in GA4. Maybe people prefer to work with dashboards. But I think that it's really worth using the customized section in GA4 to create those reports and just have them right there, because it's kind of nice to have everything in that one place instead of, people often will forget dashboards exist or stop using them internally. So that's a good way to force your team to, have it right there. Looker Studio still has so many use cases, particularly if you've got, a report with a lot of different features or complexity, or you want people to be able to filter it really easily, or kind of change configuration. That's probably where I'd use Looker. So where you want it to be a bit more interactive, or there's just like a lot of detail, I think I would probably be using Looker more in that situation. And another situation is, as I said, for real-time reporting, using Looker as kind of the interface for that real-time data collection is good if you've kind of got like a requirement that goes beyond the basic real-time reporting. If you want to use, custom parameters in real time and look at a really big report, then Looker is really good for that as well. Hopefully that helps. Question about a live demo. I'm not sure which section you were talking about, but I'm hoping that whatever it was, I will be about to show you anyway. Okay, cool. Great questions, everyone. Let's move on to events and conversions. Okay, so we briefly touched on the definitions of these two things in the first session, but today we're going to talk about creating custom events. So creating the events that are specific to your site and that you're probably going to be using the most in your reporting. So first up, we have the distinction between an event and a conversion. An event is a measurement of an interaction, right? So it's any interaction you want to measure, be that button clicks or scrolls or, related article clicks. That's an event. It's any interaction. Conversions are different. They're a subset of events that are valuable to your business. Okay, so we don't just want any old button click to be a conversion. We want a conversion to represent something that is valuable. Again, that's completely based on whatever your own business definition is, what your own, revenue model is. But a conversion will often be something like, finalizing a subscription, signing up for a newsletter, creating an account. Those are probably general examples of conversions. It's obviously easier in something like e-commerce world where it's a purchase, but in publisher land, we also have a lot of other really important success measures that we would consider conversions. So yes, all conversions are events, but not all events are conversions. Probably the best way to think about it. Events, I won't spend too long on this. It's a distinct user interaction on web or app. This is something we had in UA as well, but now it is a lot more relevant because it is kind of the basis of our actual data model in GA4. So as an example, an event might be loading a page. So now page views are considered events. So that's an example now. Clicking a link, completing a purchase. These are all interactions you can measure with events. Custom events. So these are events with names and parameters that you define so you can collect something that's specific to your business. Okay, so there's two ways of creating and modifying events. The first is with code, so either using Google Tag Manager or with an API like GTag or Firebase. So like we were saying before, if you wanted to collect an event every time someone clicked on a related article, you could do that with some GTM code or by pushing through events in Firebase if you use app. The other way is within the configuration section of GA4 under the configure events option. So the second option is amazing. It's a very cool feature of GA4. However, it doesn't necessarily replace the first option because we still need to collect some events with code. And I'll go into the distinction in a second. So in this webinar, I'm going to focus more on the second option and kind of like the reasons you would use it. In the next session, I'm going to talk about how you actually set up events in GTM. So kind of that more technical side of creating events from scratch. But today we're going to talk about how you can use this inbuilt GA4 UI to actually create and modify events. Okay, so creating and modifying events in the interface. So to create an event, you can create a new event from an existing event. So this means that we're copying the existing event's parameters, but we're adding new conditions and parameters. Okay. You can also modify an event. This means that we're overriding an existing event, which means we're going to add, change, or delete conditions and parameters. So the first one is we keep our events and we add a new one. The second one is we're changing an existing event and how it's coming through. So to do this, the first thing to think about is the reasons to do this. When I first started using GA4, I did not think about the reasons, and I made some mistakes with how I did this that now I will not do again. So the reasons you might want to modify or create events in the interface. Here are some examples. Simplifying reports by using the same event name across properties and data streams. So a classic example might be that you've got one property where you're using the name screen view for screen views and another property that says viewed screen, for instance. And then when you're rolling it up together, you say, well, this is silly. We want to have the same name. So you might say, let's modify this event to have the same name in both places. That's an example you might want to use. You also might want to fix a measurement error caused by a typo. So maybe you simply have a typo when you first set up the event. You don't want to delete all the data. Or you don't want to lose the data. This enables you to kind of just make a modification that will fix it. Create a new event based on an existing event and triggering it on specific conditions. I will go into a good example for that in a second. And narrowing the scope of an event to mark it as a conversion. So maybe there's a specific button click that is a conversion that we want to use as a custom event. So very important call out, before you create or modify an event, just make sure that the event doesn't already exist in your web code or container for GTM. So make sure you don't already have an event that's called, screen view, because if you do, that will cause confusion to the computer and it will overcount the number of times the event was triggered. So just make sure you're not using a new event name that already exists because that will cause issues. So just something to be aware of. Okay. So this is an example of creating a new event. So when we create a new event or if we modify an existing one, the way we do this is going into the admin section. So if you go to admin and to the event section under the property settings, you will see the option to create or modify events. So it lives in admin under events. So to create or modify an event, you want to include the existing event name and the conditions that will trigger the event. So let's say, for example, I want to capture a button click that occurs on the subscriptions page, right? Because this particular button click is the one that means that they've subscribed. Okay, but that's just a random example. If I'm doing that, I need to include the event name button click as my existing event. And then the condition that it has to match is that the page is subscribed, right? So that's just a basic example where we're saying, here's the event we want to use, button click, but we want to only fire it when the page says subscribed, and that is going to be our new event called subscription clicks. Okay, so pretty simple. It's saying, let's kind of confine the scope of our button click event because we don't want to count every button click as a conversion. Let's just pick the ones that happen on this page and say that that is our new event called subscriptions. And that way we can treat it separately, we can analyze it separately, we can make it a conversion all within the UI without having to do any extra code implementation. So that's just an example. Obviously, that is dependent on how your site is set up, but you get the idea. You also want to include parameters that analytics will send automatically. So, for instance, you're saying, we already collect things like button text and, a page of site section or something as a parameter on button click events. Keep collecting those, and then maybe also add, a modification to one of the parameters. So maybe you want to, change the name of button click to, of the button text to like CTA text. Okay, I'm making up random examples, but hopefully that kind of makes sense. So you're choosing the event that's your basis. You're putting a condition on it to match the actual specific custom event you're creating. And then you're saying if you want the parameters exactly as they are, or if you want to change or modify any of them. And that's how we create an event. Before I move on, the logic with modifying is similar. You'll just kind of, you obviously have different use cases when you modify something. You might just simply want to change the way that the event name comes through. But this example of creating one is probably best to use for this section because it kind of gives you an idea of how you can use existing events to zero in on the really important ones that are more like conversions. So conversions. Conversion is a user action that is valuable to your site. That is valuable to your business, your site. If you want to measure something as a conversion, you simply mark that event as a conversion. So there is a section in admin called conversions. You have a big list of all your events, and you can say, let's switch this little thing on and make it a conversion. And then that's it. Very, very simple. It's like creating a goal. But yes, it's just a very, very simple process. Create UA destination goals as conversions in GA4. So this is an example of how we might want to kind of create the GA4 equivalent of something that we have as a conversion in UA, right? So in UA, you might say, okay, well, we had this goal that we set up that was based on, someone landing on our thank you page, right? So our goal was called subscription complete. And if they went on this page, it fired. So how do we do that now? Because, we've got this different event structure and we don't have this destination option. How do we make this a conversion? I don't understand. And to which I would say, I will tell you in the next few slides. So in GA4, kind of the key difference here is we can only mark an event as a conversion. So you don't have that destination option. You can't just say, this is a goal on this page. We have to use events. So this is actually an application of what I was just kind of using as an example, right? So say you've got an event name that already exists called page view, which you probably do if you've got, just the config tag on your site, you're collecting page views. And you still have this situation where if someone lands on the thank you page, they send a page view, that means the same thing as it always has. It means that they have subscribed. So you want that to be your conversion. So what you can do here is you can create an event in the same way as we just looked at before. And you'll say, I want you to use the event name of page view, right? So that's one of the conditions is that the event we're talking about is page view. But I also only want you to fire this event when the location is the thank you page. And then you name this something like, subscribed, or in this case, application submitted, thank you page view, right? So this becomes its own extra event with its own special name that just because it matches those conditions. So once that's created, you then have that, and once it starts recording data, that will then start showing up in your conversion list. So in this list with the different sliders, you'll see that event. It's thank you page view, and you can just mark it as a conversion. So that's kind of the way that we would do the goal creation equivalent in GA4, right? Is that instead of using the destination concept, we say, all right, we've got all of our events coming through for page views. Let's make a special event just based on page view for this page and mark it as a conversion. So it's great because it doesn't involve any extra code. It's simply modifying the data collection you've already got, even if it's something as simple as a page view, and then just flicking a box and making it a conversion. So yes, that is a little use case for you. Okay, moving on to another important section, we're going to talk about audiences. So audiences. What is an audience? It is a group of users who share the same attributes. It's a group of users who have generated similar behavioral data. So as you can, when you create audiences, you can segment by all sorts of things. It might be a dimension. It might be, an audience of people who have had a certain number of page views of the sports section, and that's your sports readers. It might be by a metric, highly engaged users, those that have had the most sessions or lifetime value, or even by events. You can do it by events of, people who have, clicked on, who've had an add to cart event for subscriptions but haven't converted. Random examples. So as analytics gets new data about your users, the memberships are reevaluated to ensure that they still meet audience criteria. Okay, so what we're saying is that as time goes on, analytics will say, does this person still fit in the audience? If yes, they stay. If not, they're kicked out. This all happens automatically. It's not something you have to do manually, which is amazing. So in GA4, audiences can be shared, once they're created, can be shared with your advertising products. So like Google Ads, meaning you can target that specific group of users with your marketing platforms. So understanding the data we have available to create segments and audiences. So first up, Google Signals. This is behavioral and profile data. As I said, this is collected by Google when someone's consented to share it. And this is where we get things like age group, interest, device type. Okay, so that kind of data is available. Again, it is only collected when it's consented to by a user. So, this isn't like all encompassing like your first party data, but it's really important to remember you have this available if you're doing, an interest-based campaign. Conversion metrics, so quantitative measurements of behavior. So purchase value is the best example, or it might be, lifetime conversions, so the number of conversions someone's had in their whole life as a customer of your site, or purchase revenue, so the highest spenders on the site, for instance. Events, so we can use events to create segments. Some examples might be session starts, number of page views, or article completions. So this can help us measure engagement and create audiences based on really engaged users. And user scope data, so data tied to users that's persistent throughout their lifetime. So something like the country they're from, or, the day they became a member, or their membership/subscription tier. So pretty much anything can be used to create an audience. So to create a custom audience, you do this by setting conditions based on the dimension, metric, and event data you collect from a property. So when you set your conditions, you set the scope of when the conditions must be met, whether it's across all sessions, a single session, or a single event. You also select the membership duration and the audience trigger. All right, so I'm going to go into each of these steps. So first up, let's say you had an audience you wanted to create for users who completed an article. So to do this, you're going to first up choose to include users when the article completed event happened, right? So we get our list of different dimensions and metrics we can use to build the audience. We're going to choose the event of article completed. And then we want to maybe pick, make sure that we're just looking at articles or a particular content group. So we might say, let's choose a parameter to go with this event. So you can see that we first choose our event, then we say this is the parameter to add, and we can pick a content group, right? Or maybe we want to pick, a content topic. So we might want to pick just sports or something. And then you can add the conditions in there for the parameters. So Pick our criteria. If it's an event, pick the event, add a parameter, and set the condition. So you can add multiple conditions for users to be included in your audience. So here as an example, we might add a condition that they're within a certain age range. You might want to look at kind of the younger half of your users. And so that means that you're getting that extra level of granularity of, engaged readers. So they've completed an article and they're within this age group. All right. So that might be for a particular campaign you're doing. You can also exclude readers. You might want to exclude subscribers, for instance, if you're looking to create a campaign for people to get them to subscribe. You don't want to advertise to your current subscribers, so you can add an exclusion condition as well. So this is a cool feature. This is condition scoping. So this is where you can get a bit more granular about when these users have completed these actions. So if we're choosing across all sessions, that means that you're saying, I want these conditions to have happened across their whole lifetime. So it doesn't have to just have been in one session. It can be their whole lifetime. Within the same session is they all happen within the same session, obviously. And within the same event means that that event has all these conditions met in one. So let's do some examples of these. First up, maybe you want to create a session, an audience of users who've read a particular article and went on to visit the careers page. Okay, so maybe you're looking for people who are interested in something and looking for a job. And this has all happened within the last 30 days, right? So across all sessions, you can say, they don't have to have done this in the same time. I just want people who've done these two things at any point. Okay. Within the same session, so this might be, a certain event that happened. In this case, we're talking about something like a job application. So this might be, it's their first visit. We want to see if on their first visit they submitted this application, or as a publisher, it might be, on their first visit, did they subscribe, right? So that would be something where we go, within the same session, did these two things happen? And within the same event. So this might be where we're looking specifically at people who submitted a form on a certain page. So in this example with the job application, we're saying, people who have submitted a job application on the copywriter page. Another thing to call out here is membership duration. So the membership duration is saying that once someone's added to an audience, how long will they be included before they are no longer part of it? So the maximum you can choose here is 540 days, so like a year and a half. But you can make it smaller if you want, if it's a shorter campaign, if you just want to kind of target someone for a shorter period of time. Every time a user engages in behavior that meets the criteria for the audience, the duration is reset. So to the full value of this option. So every time, you say I'm on my 29th day of being in an audience, and then I complete another article about sports, for instance, for this particular audience that we've created, then once again, I'm included to the full duration of 30 days. So every time you do it, you will be included for the duration. Another feature we have here with GA4, which is very cool, is the audience trigger. So the audience trigger enables you to trigger events when users become audience members. So say that I'm added to that sports readers audience, we might want to send an event that says new sports reader or something like that. So this means someone's added, it sends the event, you give it the name you want it to, and you can decide whether you want to fire it only once or when people requalify, right? So you might say, okay, we actually only care about this happening once for someone, or you might care about it every time that they are included in the audience. So that would be that log an additional event when the membership refreshes. So the reason you use these might be for just analysis of looking at what's happening with audiences and, when people are getting added, is there a particular day or a particular campaign that coincided with a lot of new members, or for conversions. So you might want to use that for bidding as well. I will answer this quick question that's come in that's very relevant, which is what is the difference between audiences and segments? Short answer is they're really very similar. Segments are basically an audience that hasn't been shared for activation, right? So a segment is where we create a subset of users within the platform to analyze. So that's where you might say, all those same conditions of, article completed, on a particular sports page, for instance. That would be a segment. An audience is where we take that segment and we export it. It's where we have concepts like the membership duration, right? So when we're saying that we're actually activating this group, it's not just like a subset of analysis that we're doing in the platform without actually anything real coming of it. It's taking that segment and then performing some activation of, retargeting or advertising or something like that. So the difference really is just if it's used for analysis or if it's used for actual retargeting and activation. But yeah, they're pretty much the same thing in how you build them and the theory of them. So suggested audiences. If you're not sure what audiences to create, GA4 provides you a number of fully configured ones that you can use as is, or you can modify them if you want as well. So some examples would be recently active. So this will just be out of the box available. 7-day lapsed users. So if you want to find an audience of people who haven't been back in a week and you want to retarget them, that will be created automatically. And also purchases. So those are some examples there of the ones that GA4 will just give you out of the box. Okay. Audience templates. So these are partially configured audiences with a set of dimensions and metrics that form a basis of widely applicable audiences. So as an example, you might find that you've got a suggested audience within a template. So see how we've got under suggested audiences some different subsets. Here with templates, we have something like demographics. And this is where it's saying, here's the template and you can choose, which age group you want to specifically target here in the audience, or you can say, with technology, for instance, we want to just have users that are on this certain operating system, right? Or even someone from a certain channel. So this means that instead of having to do it from scratch, you can go to suggested audiences, pick a template and say, all right, cool, I want to create an audience for people who came from Facebook. Here's the template. I just have to select one value and boom, it's done. So just keep that in mind that if you are creating a nice and simple audience based on one of these 3 topics, you can do it pretty quickly with the suggested audiences instead of having to make it custom. The question about the audience being dynamic, yes, all of those audiences, suggested or not, will be dynamic. So they will, I assume you mean, will they, be updated and added to and refreshed over time? The answer is yes, they're always dynamic and a living thing. Predictive audiences. This is a very cool section where you will kind of get some automatic machine learning expertise from Google in your GA4 data model. So GA4 will analyze your data. It will look at previous data that's from your users, and based on its machine learning analysis of, what are the trends we see in users, what kind of clustering do we have of people based on, their behavior that leads them to eventually convert, for instance. It'll look at that past data. It'll find common features between these users. And then it will say, all right, based on that, we predict that these people are going to convert in the next 7 days. Or we predict that these people are likely to churn. So using the machine learning side of things that is hard to set up, and I won't go into too much detail on how it works, GA4 just does it for you based on your data, crunches the numbers, and then uses that to create an audience that's predicting future behavior. So these are great if you want to, retarget people who are likely to churn, or offer them, maybe offer them a discounted subscription or something. You can just use these out of the box predictive audiences to immediately, activate that campaign against them. So to train these models successfully, there are criteria attached. It is a very complex model, so you do have to kind of meet some minimum data collection requirements. So the main thing is that you need to have a minimum level of users that are positive or negative, in the cases of purchases and churns. You need to have a minimum number for GA4 to actually be able to create a predictive model. So yeah, anyone who's, done statistics would know that you kind of need to have that minimum level of data for the predictions to be considered valid or actually reliable. So that's kind of something you might see, that when you first set up the property, you might say, oh, where are my predictive audiences? It probably just means you don't have enough data yet for the model to actually run as it should. So that's audiences. There's a lot to go off there. As I said, have a play around in the platform, look at the ways you can build things. It's definitely the best way to learn what's there and to kind of get it into your head that all these things are available in GA4. All right, so we are going to finish off with a bit of data analysis stuff. So I'm going to show you some examples of how we would do data analysis in GA4 for publishers. This is a section that will be relevant to some of the questions we've had earlier about, setting up reports and how to demo some of the custom reports as well and the explorations. So hopefully this will be useful for those of you that were wondering about reporting specifically. So let's start off with content planning. So this use case is a key one for publishers, where we're looking at, our most influential content and how to promote it. So let's say we've got our business goal of converting and monetizing, pretty standard. We've got a KPI of growing subscriber base and a metric of, the number of monthly conversion events or the percentage of subscribed users. So this is an example here for a subscription-based model. So the prerequisites to actually activate this use case would be first that you're tracking subscription events. So that's important. We need to be able to track subscriptions to analyze them. And secondly, that you're tracking information about articles. So you want to be collecting that metadata that is relevant for content planning. So article title, content group or category, author, publish time, etc. Whatever different ways you have of tagging your articles, in the CMS or internally, how you categorize things. So here's an example of how we would use the exploration report to identify our influential content and promote it. So first up, in GA, you can create a segment of sessions containing a subscription event. So as I said, a prerequisite is that you're tracking subscriptions, whether it is with an event you've set up in GTM or with an event you've created in GA4 in the interface, like we showed earlier. Just got to have an event for subscriptions. That means you can easily make a segment that includes anyone that has had that subscription event occur. Okay, simple segment with one event criteria. From there, we go to the explore section and we want to create an exploration report with the number of page view events broken down by article title, author, or category. So in this example, we're using title. And as you can see with the configuration, what we're doing here is looking first up with the segment applied of subscribers. So that's the first criteria, is that we've applied that subscriber event segment. Our row dimension is page title. So that's where you could put, content category or author, whatever it is. That goes into your row as your dimension. And then your value is event count. The final thing to do there is to add a filter to say you're looking at the page view event. Otherwise, you'll just get every single event that's happened on that title. Instead, you want to say, let's just look at page views by using the event filter to say event name equals page view. Very simple. So we've got dimension of row title, value of event count, and a filter just specifying page views as the event. So that's something that's important to kind of get your head around, is that in UA, because page views were considered separately to events, we would just use page views as the value. Now you're using event count and specifying the page view event. Okay, so just a slight difference because of the data model. So from there, we've applied our segment to look at the ones that influence subscription. So, what are the articles that had page views in sessions that had subscriptions, right? So this is where the two are working together, where our segment is showing us these are subscription sessions, and our dimensions and metrics are showing us these are the pages that had lots of views in the session that had a subscription. So this means that this could be considered our influential content. You can also, if you're keen to do a bit of advanced stuff, you can add a criteria that the event had to happen before the subscription. That's something else you can have a play around with. But in this case, we can say this page view happened in this session. We're considering it influential. From there, you can, have that kind of dynamic explore report that you can save. You can share it internally. Might be something you look at every day. And that might inform, okay, this is what we want to promote on our homepage or on our suggested article module or on social media, for instance. These articles have really done well for conversions, so let's use that in our marketing efforts. And that will help you to kind of then go on from there to analyze the impact of that. So this is an example of using the data to actually inform your decisions in terms of marketing or how your site is going to be laid out, just based on using some simple event configurations in GA4. Another one we have here is a time of day report. This is kind of a similar configuration to the example we had earlier when someone was asking about landing pages by channel or by acquisition source. In this case, we're saying, let's look at page titles, or for me, I'd probably use category here. I'd use content category as my row dimension. And as your column dimension, you have the hour of the day. So again, we're just doing this in our explore section, simple drag and drop, where we've got, content group or content category as our dimension row. And then we've got, hour of day as our column. And within that, we will have our event count of page views. And this shows us, for every hour of the day, you can order it in terms of ascending hours, what is the most popular category. Okay, so this is just a simple way of using a pivot table, putting your page title on one side, putting hour of day on the other, and counting page views as a pivot. And again, this is all just based on page view tracking. You'll get all of this data simply by having the GA4 configuration tag on your site. You don't need to have any custom events. All of this stuff comes out of that basic event tracking, and it's all possible to do without much extra work. Okay. Another one, I think this is a really, really good one to look at. This is the subscription funnel. So this enables us to look at drop-off points in the path to subscribing. So to do this, we would start off with a funnel exploration report. Again, I think earlier I was talking about how you can use e-commerce to track that subscription funnel. This is another way of doing it without e-commerce, where you're simply using page titles and event names on your site to create a funnel in the explore section. So this is a good alternative if you don't have the ability to set up e-commerce tracking. So we'd set up the funnel steps that readers take before subscribing. So you might start with, session start, article page view, and then paywall impression, which is the example here. So if we've got an event here that's firing whenever someone sees a paywall, and then we have finally the subscription complete event. So you'll see that you can also break this down by the source to see where your converting readers come from. So this means that we have kind of a number of different applications. The first is that I can say, all right, who ended up subscribing, and where did they come from? Does that inform how we're dealing with acquisition and marketing? But I think the really cool thing you can do here is look at that drop-off section where people did not go on to subscribe. So here, as you can see, the way that GA4 sets out these funnels is a lot more detailed than in the previous UA version. Here we have not just a section that shows us who did convert, but also who dropped off at this point and didn't go on to. And what you can do here is simply click on that drop-off section and say, make a segment out of these people. So it's that simple to kind of do the funnel, find the drop-off point, make a segment, and retarget. So you might want to retarget those people with, your 10% off on the subscription or something like that, or a campaign about the benefits of subscribing. And that's really, really easy to do just with your event tracking all the way through that funnel. So I'd highly encourage having a look at that. It's probably going to make it a lot easier for you to actually create those audiences without having to have a really detailed understanding of tracking in the data model. Okay. So this is pretty much the end. I have one more question I will answer. Suppose the page view event has certain parameters like section name, and I get a click event on the same page. A page view parameter is also available for the click event. Can I use session name with the click event here? Great question. So this all depends on the way you've set up your tracking. So the page view event, when you set it up in GTM, for example, will have, you can set up parameters that will always be collected. So for instance, you might have your parameter that's, a custom parameter for your business, which is section name, and that would go in your config tag. So every time there's a page view, you get that value. If you want to get the value for your click events, when the event is set up, you need to ensure that value is also attached to that event. So all the events are individual. They need to have the parameters attached that you want to be analyzing across events. Okay, so not all events will need to have all the parameters, right? You don't need a article name or content category parameter on all of your page views, for example, because some pages might not have a category. Maybe a bad example, maybe something like author, for instance. But if you do want to have something like section name across everything, it goes on your config tag, and it can also go on your event tag as well. So yes, in that case, as long as you set it up in GTM that way, you can certainly collect it. It's usually very easy to do. As long as it's in the data layer on your site, you can pick it up with a variable. So this kind of, again, brings me nicely into this section. In the next session, we're going to go into more detail on actually setting up the technical tracking in GTM. So that will address a lot of the questions we had today about things like not set, or when we see different parameters coming up, how that all works. So next week, in the next webinar, we're going to go into best practices for data collection. Don't worry if you're not a technical expert. It's just good to know how it works, so you know what to ask for of your developers and things like that. And you might find that it actually is a lot simpler than you thought. So I'd highly recommend coming along to that, because learning how data collection works just makes analysis so much easier, and I think a lot more interesting as well. After that, in our fourth webinar, we're going to go into a deep dive on content planning and recirculation concepts. So really digging into the use cases now that we've got all the fundamentals down. So we covered a lot today. We covered reports, so looking at standard, custom, and exploration reports. We spoke about events and conversions, setting up new events and modifying events. We talked about audience building, and turning segments into audiences. And we did a little bit of data analysis for publishers, so looking at those content use cases in the explore section. So as I said, the next session is going to be on data collection. So as I said, we're going to be looking at how we actually set up tracking with GTM or with other methods of tracking. But we're also going to be talking about dual tagging, which is something a lot of you might be doing if you're still making the transition between UA to GA4. A lot of publishers will have both versions of tags set up. So we're going to go through how to do that. And yeah, just try to make sure that you're prepared to kind of have dual collection in place for as long as you need until you're ready to move all onto GA4. So going on from here, thank you so much all for coming along today. Thank you for your great questions. If you have any more, I can stick around for another 5 or 10 minutes so I can answer any more questions you might have. But if you could, we'd love it if you could complete the post-webinar survey. And again, if you are interested in those support, implementation support sessions and one-on-one coaching sessions, we're going to provide more detail in the next webinar on those, so that if you do have a lot of extra questions, or you're really looking for some more one-on-one support with your implementation, those applications will be opening soon. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. Feel free to push through any more questions you might have. But otherwise, I'll see you next week to talk about tagging and data collection. All right. Thanks, everyone.